evening to the Indian audience available here. I am Nishtha Vishwakarma, and I head the Outreach and Communications Department at the Maritime Research Center. And I'm going to be the host for you today. And it's with my great pleasure to welcome you for today's important webinar titled India-US Strategic Maritime Partnership, Approaches Both Partners Bring to the Maritime Domain. This event, I would like to emphasize, is being jointly hosted by the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, also called as NESA. And we'd particularly like to thank Mr. Jeffrey Pine, who is an associate professor at NESA, for tying up with us and for organizing this event. This is the second time that we have joined hands with NESA to host a webinar. It was previously in October 2024 when we hosted a similar webinar talking about the India-US Strategic Partnership and things related to the security aspects of the maritime domain. So we are thrilled to host all of you today from the various parts of the world. And I think the timing of this event is very significant because it brings together strategic thinkers, policymakers, academicians, and stakeholders from both India and the United States who are at the forefront of the maritime policy and security. Also, as we all know, that India-US partnership is growing and it's playing a very important role in shaping the future of the Indo-Pacific region. So, and this webinar is particularly going to focus on the different approaches of each of the partners, exploring the shared interests, the challenges, and the way forward in strengthening this vital relationship. So before we get started, I would again like to thank NESA for partnering with us and for collaborating with us for making this event possible. And before we begin, just a few housekeeping points to ensure a smooth experience for everyone. Number one, I would request the audience to ensure that their microphones are muted unless, especially at the time when the speakers are speaking and making their presentation. This will help us minimize the background noise and ensure that the speakers are heard clearly. For the Q&A session, we would encourage that you participate, but it will be better if you can post your questions in the chat box instead of, immediately after the speakers are done and you raising the question. That would not be appropriate. So it's just better if you can post your questions in the chat box instead. Also, we appreciate your cooperation and we look forward to a stimulating and productive evening ahead. And morning for the ones joining us from the US. We now look forward to diving deep into today's discussions, and I'm confident that the collective insights from our speakers will help us better understand the evolving nature of India-US Strategic Maritime Partnership. So without further delay, I would like to invite the first speaker to take the floor. So we have with us Dr. Commander Arnab Das, who is the founder and director of the Maritime Research Center. So before I call upon Dr. Das, I would like to speak a little bit about him. Dr. Das is a researcher, maritime strategist, and an entrepreneur. He's the founder, like I mentioned, that he's the founder and director of the Maritime Research Center, which is working on this unique concept of underwater domain awareness. Dr. Das has served in the Indian Navy for over 2 decades, and he did his master's and PhD from a very reputed institute in India, which is IIT Delhi, as a uniformed officer, and he undertook several research and development projects during his 7-year tenure at IIT Delhi. He was later invited to Tokyo University as a visiting researcher for his work on freshwater dolphins. After he retired from the Indian Navy, he worked at the Acoustic Research Lab at the National University of Singapore. So now I hand over the mic to Dr. Das to take over and present his thoughts. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Nishtha. First of all, thank you once again, NESA, Jeffrey Pine, for making this happen. My sincere thanks to the speakers from both the sides, Nancy ma'am, Dr. Samir Lalwani, Dr. Michael Kugman, Ambassador Mudgal sir, Mr. Sanjay Baru, Sarabjit Parmar sir, Professor Atri. Thank you all very much for making it all happen. I will dive straight away into my presentation. So I just wanted to make an introductory remark on what this UDA framework is all about, so that all our experts in the panel can revolve their discussion on the Indo-US relations around the UDA framework. So the UDF framework for safe, secure, sustainable growth. As you know, 75% of the earth is water, and in that 90% is below the surface of the water. But unfortunately, the underwater domain awareness has somehow not received enough attention, is what I would like to submit. And there's a lot of work to be done. And particularly for the global south and the Indo-Pacific, it is very important that we have a broader focus, not a very narrow focus on security. So the safety from natural disasters, security, of course, sustainability and growth need to be given far more priority. And when I say in the new global order, we are now focusing on the Indo-Pacific in the new global order. So what are the uniqueness of the Indo-Pacific and how do we take things forward? So typically, it is very important for us to acknowledge the tropical challenges and opportunities. The tropical waters are very, very different from the temperate and the polar region, particularly the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, where the underwater technology development happened during the Cold War period. The sonars that are the main devices for underwater domain awareness or looking below the water suffer 60% degradation of performance. So it's very, very important that in our strategic discourse, the tropical characteristics are given priority. Typically, I find that the tropical characteristics misses out, and that gives us a very, very different understanding or appreciation of the underwater domain. Now, if we just look at the Indo-Pacific strategic space, by definition, it is the tropical waters of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So it's very, very important that the tropical waters or the tropical characteristics are understood. And there are multiple other aspects, rich biodiversity, the sediment transports pattern is very, very different. So navigability becomes very, very difficult in these waters. So, and of course, the sonar performance, I mean, 60% degradation is something we need to keep in mind. Now, for any strategic perspective, people, economy, nature become very, very critical. And in this part of the world, I think 1/4 of the humanity resides in this part of the world. I mean, I'm talking about just the Indian Ocean region. So the challenges are very different. The socio-economic, socio-political, and socio-cultural challenges are very different. We also boast of 10,000 years of civilization legacy. In the 13th century, we did boast of a very rich maritime heritage. So how do we take the traditional knowledge and traditional practices forward, and how do we map it onto the modern ways to make sure that we are able to tackle the site-specific characteristics? So the coastal communities and the riverine communities need to be prioritized, and we need to have inclusive governance. Typically, what we see in this part of the world is the development becomes actually a big problem, or the local communities or the indigenous community become a victim of development. So how do we make it more inclusive is something we need to look at. Now, the economy is a very important part. I mean, and we know post-COVID, there has been a serious issue as far as the economic situation is concerned. So how do we bring more and more activities which are sustainable and which are able to take things forward? So it's very, very important to identify those areas and to take things forward. Identify and then try and resolve those issues. And of course, sustainability will always remain a very important aspect. And there are, I mean, when we talk about environment impact assessment, there are issues which completely get neglected. Something like acoustic habitat degradation, which is very unique to the underwater domain. Now, maritime domain awareness, we are all aware, became very, very critical, or got enough attention, particularly post the 9/11 globally, led by the US, and in the Indian Ocean region after the 26/11. And India did have a role to play in that. I mean, not just that we suffered, but the MDA post that became very, very important, and enough infrastructure investment and a lot of effort has gone into it. But my worry is that it remained a security-driven formulation. So the other stakeholders found it very hard to participate in the whole MDA framework. And as a result of that, it remained on the surface. The underwater component somehow did not get enough attention because the capacity and capability building is very, very different from the surface MDA that we look at. So we need to make it far more inclusive is what my submission here is. Now, the stakeholders are well known. I will not dwell too much here, but just to give you a sense of what it is. I mean, even if we deal with a lot of transboundary river situations, and security in the transboundary rivers is also a very important aspect. So there again, underwater threat, and particularly given the political volatility in this region and the non-state actors being so active, we need to be very, very careful, and we need to develop underwater capabilities in a very, very different manner. Particularly blue economy, the contribution of the blue economy to the GDP of this part of the world is really very, very minuscule. How do we take it forward? And there are certain very unique challenges. I mean, if you just look at food security, on one end, fish stock is on the decline, but the bycatch is of the order of 80%. So how do we reconcile? So it will require a very strong regulatory framework and monitoring mechanism to make sure that we are able to manage the underwater resources in a much better manner. And some of these countries in this part of the world have become victims, although they have so much resources available, but they are not being able to harness it in a proper way. Deep sea mining is a very important issue. There is so much resources available, but we are too dependent on external powers, and many times we get manipulated. So indigenous effort is very, very important, particularly to address the tropical challenges. Now, the sediment transport pattern I mentioned, dredging has become a de facto tool, but it is extremely unsustainable. So we need to look at it very, very differently. And of course, marine environment and disaster management. Acoustic habitat degradation has not yet, now International Maritime Organization has recognized, and there's a lot of discussions happening how to manage acoustic habitat degradation. But we need to look at this in a very holistic scale, and of course, disaster management. I'm not here to say that we can prevent a natural disaster, but with early warning, we need to minimize loss of life and property. Just to give you a sense of, these freshwater dolphins are very unique. They are blind, so they use acoustic vision. So in the name of development, somehow we may make it very unsustainable for these unique species. So we need to address them in a very, very nuanced way. And of course, science and technology, or the digital transformation, is something we need to, many times the conventional wisdom says that we will put sensors. But if you just look at India, we have 20 lakh square kilometers or 2 million square kilometers of EEZ. How many sensors can we put? So how can we put smart means or smart technologies to minimize the sensor deployment? And sensor deployment should be only to validate the models that we have. So there are methods. Modeling and simulation is a well-known method, and we need to kind of use them to make it more easy for the global south to participate. Otherwise, it's a non-starter. So this is the framework that we have come up with, and this is something we would like to propose. If you look at the 4 sides of the cube, strategic security, blue economy, sustainability and climate change, and digital transformation, all of them may have their unique requirement, but the core would be the acoustic capacity and capability building. Typically, because of the fragmentation among the stakeholders, resources get divided. But if we can pool in resources and synergize effort, we can comprehensively enhance our acoustic capacity and capability building. Unless the sonar gives good performance, 60% degradation is a very, very difficult thing to take forward. So how do we invest in field experimental R&D is something we need to look at. If you look at the vertical construct, a lot of sensing, analysis, and then policy formulation is what we need to follow. Typically we follow a top-down approach. We even, along with technology, we also get these frameworks from outside, which does not work in our waters because of the uniqueness. And that makes it very difficult to take it forward. So, and also I talked about the demography. The young aspirational population is looking for meaningful career opportunities. So these smaller cubes that you see can also be divided into many thousands cubes where they can be trained and we can make them more employable. Unemployability is a word that is sometimes used, but if they can be integrated into this, even the coastal communities can be integrated, and we can provide digital solutions to their local problems. So we need to look at it very, very differently. So this is a framework which I would like to call it comprehensive, structured, and inclusive. marine spatial planning or the digital transformation in the marine domain or underwater domain is being talked about. But again, here, I mean, what you see here is a modeling and simulation based approach using the automated identification system data, which gives us a sense of how the underwater noise looks like. So this kind of, I mean, you can only see a two-dimensional picture here, but a three-dimensional picture has been created by our team. And this gives you a spatio-temporal mapping of the entire, and this can be extended across the world because the data is available. I mean, we are only showing you for the Indian Ocean region. And this can be used for various purposes. Like one is the marine mammal conservation. I mean, you can see on the western coast of India, the noise is very high, and we are corresponding to that, we are seeing massive stranding of big whales. But such even deployment of sonars, passive sonars, or even submarine deployment can use such a thing. And we have built those tools and we've been recognized globally for that. Even underwater noise is very, very important to manage the noise due to shipping. I mean, below 1 kilohertz is the shipping noise, which is the most dominant, and how to manage that or how to contain that. And that has gone to International Maritime Organization as India's paper. And India has been now nominated as a lead country for underwater noise in the Indian Ocean. We are very proud to be part of that. I mean, we wrote that paper, and we're happy that we've been recognized for our effort. Now, what is acoustic capacity and capability building? I mentioned modeling and simulation. Now, the field validation will require to see, to understand, and to share. The to see is the sensors and the platforms, autonomous underwater vehicles, and various surface platforms or submarines that can take the sensor to the deployment location. This is a part which we can definitely, we can collaborate, and we need support. I mean, even US has developed a lot of capability. This is something where we need to collaborate and we need to get their support. But the second part, to understand, is something I feel that a lot of indigenous effort is required, because pre-processing, I mean, the local conditions are very, very different. The tropical conditions that we've been talking is very different. And unless we put indigenous effort, I don't think a generalized solution will not work here. So site-specific efforts will be required. So the pre-processing and even the application-specific, because again, the deployments will be very, very unique. So the data analysis has to be indigenous, and I think there is enough capability here. The focus is required. The third is to share. Now, depending on the user, a very customized display is required. Whether it is a policymaker, he needs very different strategic data, but the stakeholder will require tactical information for managing the operation. And even at the ground level, I mean, whether it is a fisherman or whether it is a coastal community person, they need very specific data. And even the displays will have to be unique. I mean, at the ground level, they need smaller mobile platforms or mobile apps, but at the top level, we can have big screens. So it has to be very, very customized. The second is the manpower. I mean, when we talk about digital transformation, we need three types of manpower. I mean, first is the high-end data analysts. I mean, who look at the entire computational infrastructure, data analysis, and all that. But the second is, once that data is received, we need domain specialists. I mean, right from political science to various other disciplines who will interpret that data and build the technology intervention and the policy intervention. And the third is more interesting for me, the field deployment specialist. I mean, we have to deploy people on the waterfront. And there, I think the coastal community and the riverine communities will be far more effective in terms of using their traditional knowledge and traditional practices to make sure that we are able to kind of harness. And it will be a very, very inclusive approach where the coastal communities become part of a larger digital transformation initiative. That's all from my side. Thank you so much for your attention.
Provoking an insightful presentation that you made about the underwater domain awareness and the various facets associated with that. I think with that, we will move on to the next speaker. We will move on to the second speaker for today's program. We have with us Mr. Michael Kugelman, who is the director of South Asia Institute at Wilson Center in the United States. He's also a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine and writes it's South Asia Brief, a weekly newsletter of news and analysis from the region. He has managed the South Asia portfolio at the Wilson Center since 2007 and leads the center's programming and research on the region. His work has been featured in prominent outlets like New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Foreign Affairs, and Al Jazeera. And I think in today's remark, he's going to be discussing about the evolving geopolitical environment in the Indian Ocean region and South Asia, and how this might shape and influence the India-US maritime cooperation. So without further ado, I would like to call Mr. Michael Kugelman to share his thoughts with all of us.
Well, thank you very much, Nishta. Let me start by thanking the two organizing entities, the Maritime Research Center and the NESA Center, for inviting me to this very timely discussion. And thank you in particular to Dr. Arnab Das and Dr. Jeffrey Payne. So I'm not a technical expert on maritime issues per se, so that's why I thought that I would take a step back and offer some reflections on how I see the US-India maritime relationship having evolved and how geopolitical and strategic factors have shaped this evolution. Maritime cooperation was one of the earlier components, perhaps one of the earliest components of the current US-India strategic partnership before many other forms of security cooperation were really starting to pick up. If you go back well more than a decade ago, the two countries were doing joint naval exercises in the Indian Ocean. Indian warships were being escorted by U.S. cargo ships. Pardon me, Indian warships were escorting U.S. cargo ships through the Strait of Malacca. And the scholar Andrew Winner has noted that back in 2007, this is 15 years ago, both countries published maritime strategies with quote, almost exactly parallel lists of mission areas. But I would say that there are three factors that have enabled the US-India maritime relationship to really strengthen since that earlier period. One is the strategic urgency it has taken on as China's power projection has moved west across the Indo-Pacific into the Western Indian Ocean region. Much of China's westward push has entailed a greater presence at sea. And China's naval modernization was initially fueled in part by its quest for sea-based energy and other resources, and that brought it to India's broader maritime backyard. And this goes back some years. I mean, as early as 2009, Indian defense officials were speaking of their maritime priorities revolving around countering China's naval modernization plans. In more recent years, there's been a growing presence of Chinese ships in the Western Indian Ocean region, including Chinese research vessels, which New Delhi has accused of being spy ships making ports of call in South Asian states. China, of course, also has its military base in Djibouti or off Djibouti, and India claims that it has seen Chinese vessels near the Andaman Sea, and so this would represent a Chinese naval presence across the entire Indian Ocean, from west to east, so to speak. Now, with the U.S. increasingly concerned about Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific, this growing Chinese naval clout has sharpened U.S. strategic attention on the maritime sphere in the Indo-Pacific and fueled U.S.-India maritime cooperation. And I should say here that the scholarship of Samir Lalwani, who I know we'll hear from later, has focused on this issue of China's growing naval clout and presence in the Indian Ocean region. I know we'll hear from him later. A second factor enabling a strengthening of U.S.-India maritime relations is the strategic significance that the U.S. has accorded to the Indian Ocean itself. There was a time when U.S. governments viewed the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans as the two most strategically significant oceans. But in recent decades, we've seen the Indian Ocean be taken more seriously on strategic levels. The change really became apparent during the Barack Obama administration. One reason for this is the China factor, but I think there are other motivations as well, such as, for example, the influential work of scholars like Robert Kaplan, who did a lot of significant scholarship on the Indian Ocean. So the Obama administration's first quadrennial defense review underscored America's interest in the Indian Ocean region stability. The Obama administration also published a maritime strategy document that listed the Indian Ocean as the second area of strategic focus for the U.S. Navy. I believe that's the first time that you'd had a formal strategic document from the U.S. government saying something like that. The third factor driving more U.S.-India maritime cooperation has been broader growth in the bilateral relationship itself over the last few decades. And there's, of course, no need to go through the details of that. Everyone on this call knows it very well. I would just say that, we often think of it being fueled by concerns over China, and it has to a great degree. But in earlier years, and I think this was alluded to by the previous speaker, it was also driven to a degree by shared concerns about Islamist terrorism, and that includes maritime aided terrorism, such as the 2008 Lashkar-e-Taiba attacks in Mumbai, when terrorists used coastal areas as a launching board. So that sharpened the importance of maritime cooperation as well. So in essence, the westward push of Chinese naval power, the Indian Ocean becoming a more significant strategic sphere in the eyes of Washington, and a growing U.S.-India relationship on the whole have all provided incentives and policy space to focus more attention on bilateral maritime cooperation. So what can we expect for maritime cooperation in the second Trump administration? I will make three brief comments on this. First, maritime cooperation will be a key focus of U.S.-India relations, but I think realistically speaking, and perhaps candidly speaking as well, it's unlikely to get a lot of substantive policy space in the immediate term, in the next few months. I think it's quite clear that the main immediate focus of the administration's foreign policy will be on countries closer to home in the Western Hemisphere, as well as focusing on trying to end the wars in Gaza and Ukraine. India and the Indo-Pacific more broadly will be important for this administration, for sure. And we've already seen a fair amount of diplomacy. Of course, our DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, has been in India this week and spoke at the Raisina dialogue. But it likely won't be until later in the year when this administration turns to the Indo-Pacific and maritime security in a more substantive way. Second, we already have a good sense of what the initial phase of U.S.-India maritime cooperation may look like once the administration is prepared to turn to it. Officials in the Biden administration during its final days identified things like tech and space as key areas to drive the next phase of U.S.-India security cooperation, and those indeed will be key focus areas for the new administration. But we've already heard about the contours of maritime cooperation in the new administration, and I think that we could look at the joint statement following the Prime Minister Modi's visit to Washington last month, or pardon me, in the end of January, I believe, as a very useful signpost for that. What we see is that maritime cooperation will fit in nicely with the broader focus and the broader anchors of U.S.-India security relations. Arms sales, for example. There was talk of completing talks on a series of new maritime patrol aircraft for India to help it strengthen its maritime surveillance capacity. Tech cooperation. There were pledges in the joint statement to include maritime technology and future discussions about defense technology cooperation, and also co-production arrangements. The two leaders in the joint statement pledged to focus on co-development and co-production in a maritime context. Maritime cooperation was also highlighted in the joint statement as a big part of U.S.-India collaborations in multilateral contexts, such as, of course, the Quad, the Indo-Pacific Quad, through maritime patrols, and through India's taking on a greater role in the combined maritime forces naval task force. Another area to watch relevant to U.S.-India maritime cooperation will be the Indian Ocean Dialogue. This was, of course, established fairly late in the Biden administration, and as I understand it, one of the initial constraints was a lack of clarity on the U.S. side about which government agency would be taking the lead in managing it. But it's clearly something that's gone forward, which I think is good. The Modi-Trump summit resulted in the launch of a new Indian Ocean strategic venture, which focuses on spurring investment and economic connectivity and commerce around the IOR. Presumably, some of this will have maritime dimensions. This can perhaps be seen as an initial deliverable through the Indian Ocean Dialogue. And I believe there's also been some talk within the administration of perhaps bringing other areas, other regions, particularly specifically East Africa, into the U.S.-India Ocean Dialogue, which could create possibilities for broader multilateral maritime collaborations. My third point is to highlight types of maritime collaborations that I think will resonate the most with the new administration, types of collaborations that Washington would find the most appealing in this era. One would be anything that entails burden sharing and maritime collaborations that would entail the U.S. not necessarily doing more work than its partners. And here I think the Quad could be an example. Also, any maritime activities focused on investment and connectivity. And here, the new Indian Ocean Strategic Venture Initiative mentioned earlier could be instructive. And finally, this administration, I think, will be interested in bilateral maritime cooperation that's multilateral, but more so smaller scale multilateralism, minilateral, plurilateral, a term that many prefer to use now, tie-ups with fourth and fifth countries, but maybe not always sixth, seventh, eighth, and ninth countries. And here I think the IMEC could come into focus. This is a project that if it truly gets off the ground, it could have a fair number of maritime dimensions. This is something that the US and India have talked about in recent weeks, and I think it could really get a lot of momentum if stability returns to the Middle East, which of course is a big if. So with that, I'll conclude. I'll end. Many thanks for the opportunity, and I look forward to the other presentations.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kugelman, for your excellent analysis on the geopolitical dynamics associated with the Indian Ocean region and how that has implications for the India-US relations going forward, especially in the maritime domain. So thank you so much. I think with this, we will move on to the third speaker of the day. Now it's time to hear from Captain Sarabjit Parmar, who is a distinguished fellow at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research. A little bit about Captain Parmar. He is a former Indian Navy officer who commanded 2 ships and a frontline anti-submarine warfare and anti-shipping helicopter squadron. He was a member of the Indian Antarctic Summer Expedition in 1991, and he attended the Management Defense course conducted by the British government in Colombo in 2005. He also represented the Indian Navy in the first international HOSTAC, which is helicopter operations from ships other than the aircraft carriers, conference held in the US in 2008. He's presently, like I mentioned, is a distinguished fellow at the Council of Strategic and Defense Research in New Delhi. So Captain Parmar, we look forward to your insights on India's maritime security strategy and the evolving nature of the maritime threats in the region. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, and a big thanks to Arnab and Jeff for this invite. And I know it's early morning your side, but I think it's nothing better than on the breakfast table than talk strategy and relationships and smile about it. So I'm going to diverge a little from what I think was expected of me, and with all due apologies, because I just attended a 3-day UDA conference in San Francisco, and therefore there are some things that I'd like to share with this audience here. And so first, let's start off as the genesis of UDA. If you would remember, we just have barely managed to keep the maritime domain awareness concept or understand it and, assimilate it and work together. And of course, the Fusion Center at Changi Naval Base is one example. What we have in Gurugram is another. We have a few dots and dashes spread over the Indo-Pacific, and starting from Japan, Singapore, India have covered. You got the RCOC in Seychelles, and you have the Madagascar Fusion Center. And similarly, there are other smaller centers across the Indo-Pacific. But the question is, have we fully understood MDA, that we can learn something in the mannerisms or the methodology we have followed in cooperation? And do remember that MDA thrives on white shipping information. And even when IPMDA was first spoken of in Tokyo in 2020, there was mention of black shipping. And even on the sidelines last year of the UN General Assembly meetings, when the foreign ministers met, the same thing was reiterated, and the aspect of MDA, sort of addressing IUU fishing also came up. So I'll put that on the back burner right now, maybe get back to it a little later. So when we look at underwater domain awareness, and Arnab has very nicely put out the challenges that the body of water under the surface presents us. First of all, you can't see there. So therefore, you are totally reliable, heavily reliant on technology, much more than the surface element. So if you are looking at UDA, and just as a side is that tomorrow would we be looking at air domain awareness as a separate entity, but that's just food for thought. So the question is that do we approach UDA as a subset of MDA, as one entity, or do we hyphenate the two, or do we look at it as a standalone area? And this approach is going to define the manner in which nations would actually decide to work together. And for the simple reason is, when we talk about UDA, the first thing anybody thinks about is submarines. Everything else comes later. So that is the one side of the cube which Arnab showed of strategic security. And if there is something that any nation who operates submarines loathes is letting the world know where the submarines are, because it defeats the whole purpose of having submarines. So that will remain a major question when we start looking at, underwater domain awareness. So again, we will get back to the dialogue of, what sort of information are we going to share? And let's put intelligence off the table for now. It's not going to happen in a multilateral environment. It will best happen on a bilateral, but that is a separate topic altogether. So when you look at UDA, this is going to be technology heavy. The cost is going to be phenomenal. I've done a little bit of searching, and I just wanted to see what are the cost of laying the US sources line. What are the cost of maintaining it? What is the cost of the GI UK line? What is the cost of maintaining it? So therefore, you get back to the drawing board and say, what is the capacity and capability, and how many nations possess that capacity and capability? And I think I can mention 4 is US, France, Russia, and China. And why I say China, because China has an unmanned ocean network already in existence in the northern part of the South China Sea, around Hainan Island and the Paracels, it has already established, and therefore that is a stepping stone. And of course, they are doing underwater surveys in the IOR, which I will reflect upon in a little bit. So that cost involves not only developing and producing, but also you need specialist ships, you need specialist trained people, and you need to have a methodology of maintaining your underwater sensors, or even UUVs if you plan to do it. And do remember, especially the fixed sensors underwater, have a power pack. And if we are going to look at a mix of active and passive sensors, then the active sensors power packs will obviously run out fast. So these are issues. And along with that is the issue that what would be the ability of the nations who decide to walk this path to absorb that technology, to bear the cost? And if we take a leaf on from Trump 2.0, I mean, the US is going to expect the nations who get involved, pay the ticket. Nothing's going to come for free. So there has to be more investments. Perhaps the synergy between India and US can permit a bilateral better understanding of establishing a UDA, but the question is where all? Would it be in the maritime zones of India, or would it be in the high seas? Because any other nation may not like to have that sort of an understanding or that sort of a system up and running in its maritime zones for the reasons that I have mentioned earlier. So one is the cost, the ability, and then of course, Arnab had mentioned the HR issue, which would remain an important issue, is that how many people would you train? And therefore you would need to have that sort of an ecosystem set up and moving around. And then, of course, is that would you make your own doctrinal concepts, or will you borrow them? And therefore, this is a whole new area which needs to be looked at from the scratch. And we have just barely started down this road. And so let me look at that. Even if we set up, say, a UDA, and this is where the strategy comes in, is that are we required to set up separate centers in case we don't want to move this sort of information through the existing fusion centers? What sort of information would be there? And then you need to define the line that will divide, the strategic part, or this military or the security part, from the economy part. And economy part is your blue economy, is your following the fish, security of submarine cables, and there is a new term that is slowly emerging, is the seabed lines of communication, your cables, your oil pipelines, your gas pipelines, and what have you out there. And therefore, the resources which are available, on the seabed where the high seas treaty is there, all right, is an issue that I think needs to be discussed, that how serious are we with the high seas treaty? It was opened for signature some time back. India generally was first off the block with all the bouquet of UNCLOS conventions and signed on the first day, but here we took a little over a year to sign it. And I'm really not sure what is the progress on the High Seas Treaty, whether it will become a reality or not. But I think this is a major aspect that when we discuss UDA, the High Seas Treaty willy-nilly has to get involved. And therefore, we need to have an understanding how are we going to approach the High Seas Treaty, which will define, again, the cooperation that will come about. Insofar as resources I've already covered in this, let's look at, how the Chinese methodology is working out. So I think a month or two back, Maldives signed an MOU with China permitting them to carry out underwater surveillance or surveys, perfectly in line with UNCLOS. UNCLOS provides for nations who don't have the capacity, capability to sign up with another nation, and there are a number of articles that quoted in UNCLOS. So this is a void that China has already moved ahead. So if we are behind them, it's going to take time for us to play catch. And by the time we decide to get our act together and we decide to work together, you'll find little less takers in the Indo-Pacific because they've already signed up with China. I was in Fiji a month back for the Fiji dialogue, and we had a Chinese research vessel berthed alongside. So the presence is already there, and the methodology that China uses is quite amazing. And just let me add on to what Professor Kugelman had said. They operate ships which are battery operated. Therefore, it means that they don't have to enter port for fueling. They are growing vegetables in glass containers, or they have their own methodology of growing vegetables while the ship sails. So the only need for the ship to enter harbor is the restriction of the human on board. And that is similar to what SSBNs and SSNs face. That the limitation is the crew. And at some point in time, they will have to hit land, and finally we look at terra firma. So, and they are laying these the survey chart or the whatever instruments you call it, and they do fixed zigzags. They're doing it on the high seas. So it's a methodology of already mapping the high seas, looking at where perhaps where fish is going, perhaps where the resources are available. And of course, China has signed the High Seas Treaty. So it's already ahead of us insofar, I would say, as the blue economy is concerned, the blue economy angle. So these are aspects that need to be looked at. A little bit on the US-India part of this. And of course, if you read the statement that came out after the Prime Minister and the President met, we got a little more jargon coming out. So one is trust, transforming the relationship utilizing strategic technology, and then you have Asia, Autonomous Systems Industry Alliance. The question is that this is all right. But if you go back to ISET and you go back to sharing of technology, I don't think the US will be willing to share all the technology. It's not shared technology with its allies. So to expect the US to share that technology with us, 100%, would be perhaps a wrong path to choose. So we would be playing the junior partner. Would we allow setting up of sensors in our maritime zone? This is something for the establishment to take up, keeping security in view. And that area obviously is going to be perhaps in most probably the Arabian Sea and in the Bay of Bengal and other places, which could make our neighbors uncomfortable. So we already have a little setback on the neighborhood first policy. So these are issues that we need to look at as far as geopolitics is concerned. These issues which I have covered would resonate in other maritime areas, even if we go ahead. But there is a method of, and that is, I'm a big fan of trilateral. So let me end my swing, but we need to look at this at a trilateral basis, look at specific issues and try to progress this further. We can either push it through the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative that looks at many issues that cover all this, or we could look at it through trilateral. There are already many existing. We just need to kickstart them again and get them working on areas of convergence, especially where UDA is concerned. But note a point of caution is that insofar as security issues are concerned, nations may not be willing, and that's my reading, that they will not be willing to open their doors fully to the UDA. So we have a lot of work to do. And then, of course, there is a need to come on the table and talk to each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Captain Parmar, for your insightful remarks. Your experience and expertise in India's maritime security strategy has always offered invaluable guidance in shaping the future of the regional maritime cooperation. Thank you so much for your remarks. Now, moving ahead, we have the next speaker with us, who is Dr. Sameer P. Lalwani, who is South Asia expert at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Sameer P. Lalwani. He's like I mentioned, that he's a senior expert at the Asia Center of the U.S. Institute of Peace, specializing in nuclear deterrence, interstate rivalry, alliance, crisis behavior, country insurgency, and Indo-Pacific security. Previously, Dr. Lalwani has served as a senior fellow for Asia Strategy and director of the South Asia program at Henry L. Simpson Center. He's also the editor of a publication called Investigating Crisis South Asia's Lessons, Evolving Dynamics and Trajectories, which was published in 2018 and has published widely in journals like Securities Studies, Foreign Affairs, and in New York Times. So I would hand over the mic to Dr. Sameer P. Lalwani to share his comments with all of us.
Well, thank you for including me in this discussion. I really appreciate the invitation by the MRC and NESA Center. And I've already learned a lot in the previous speaker's remarks. So I thought I would try to speak a little bit, again, from a U.S. perspective on U.S. objectives in the maritime partnership and some of the things the United States brings to the table, and maybe even unpack a little bit what's been going on within the trust, what was previously referred to as ISET, but the trust framework and INDUS-X in particular, which is the India-U.S. Defense Accelerator ecosystem, which I think is actually starting to build some of these capabilities, and finally sort of conclude by talking a little bit about how we operationalize these shared, joint, or even independent capabilities. So I think, Michael talked a little bit about U.S. objectives, and it's good to just confirm this for a minute. Obviously, the United States' principal interest in the Indo-Pacific is still oriented around security. So I appreciate Dr. Das's point that India in particular needs a broader focus, not just a narrow focus on security. I think, though, that that's just not how the United States looks at it presently, and may not for a while. And maybe sort of there'll be an evolution, but I think you should sort of make some calculations as to what the United States sort of orientation is towards Indo-Pacific, and it is largely in security terms. Now, I do think terms like Global South and sustainability don't appear to me to be priorities in this administration, but I think you can get there if you employ a competition framework. So, for example, to make these points about underwater domain awareness salient to the United States, obviously, if you situate it in terms of competition with China, in terms of tracking Chinese submarines or Chinese vessels in the Indian Ocean, but even in terms that you've already referred to in previous conversations about critical minerals or undersea cables or undersea lines of communication, those are all competitive frameworks that will be salient to U.S. policymakers. And also, if you cooperate on them, will result in sustainability and blue economy effects. So that's just sort of a framing point. In terms of what the United States has been working on, I think with India and sort of what it brings to the table, I think there's sort of three categories we can define it as: technology, training, and maybe to some degree algorithms. In the technology area, we're talking a lot largely about sensors. I think that's sort of, sonars and sensors has been the discussion thus far. But we're also talking about delivery and platforms. And so in the air domain, you're seeing a lot more platforms being offered or put on offer that enable better sensing capability in the sea and undersea domain. So let's take a look at sort of what we've been doing, particularly in the INDUS-X arena. Commander Parmar, who just spoke, made this point that the United States is unlikely to share technology 100% and not fully open its doors. I think that's absolutely right. That's not happening. And that's okay, right? Every state has its sort of need to protect its technology. That's true of the Russians, the French, the Israelis, the Americans and Japanese. We all sort of have limitations on what we're willing to share. But I will say that if you look at the delta over the last 10 years, and frankly, even the last 3 to 4 years, you will see a greater willingness to share more than what was previously on offer. And so you see that in terms of export control, licenses, sort of license for production, for technology assistance agreements. Those are all sort of increasing in time, and you're seeing it in products. So I think India oftentimes look to the United States government as sort of the sole source of technology sharing, technology release. But what we are actually seeing is a lot more in the commercial domain. So in air-based maritime reconnaissance, obviously the United States has sold P-8s and MH-60s to India, both for they have sort of maritime domain awareness and anti-submarine missions that are possible. And with that is also coming potentially some maintenance, repair, and overhaul capacity, particularly for P-8s, which will lead to some indigenization of the technologies that are present within the P-8I systems. MQ-9s is another, the maritime predator drones, Sea Guardians or Sky Guardians. Those are also coming with a number of sort of technology components, whether it's maintenance, repair, and overhaul, production, but also sourcing from Indian companies and Indian startups image sensor chips for ISR or dual use software for AI technologies for domain awareness. So all these areas you're seeing technology transmission through a commercial deal rather than just sort of outright handing off technology. I think this is happening in a number of other co-production agreements. Shield AI has come together with an Indian conglomerate to produce VBAT drones that they can have obviously a land mission, but also a maritime aerial surveillance mission. And I believe we should see more of this coming in the next few weeks and months. Co-production of sonobuoys is another sort of area that was announced earlier this year between Ultra Maritime and BEL and Indian DPSU. And there you're seeing, again, a co-production of a sonobuoy type that is much higher grade than what India sort of produces on its own. May not be sort of the frontline technology, but again, it's a win-win in terms of sort of optimizing both parties' interests and also resulting in technology transmission through co-production. Similarly, I think there was a recent announcement. There's been a teaming arrangement between Liquid Robotics and SAGAR Defense for essentially uncrewed service vessels, which have an underwater domain awareness capacity. And I think there was just an announcement this week. The Asia sort of announcement with in the joint statement by both leaderships talked about CERTAS capabilities being provided by L3Harris and UUVs being developed by Anduril and Mahindra. I think all these, again, in the commercial domain, they are delivering advanced technologies for advanced sensing in the underwater domain that India does not have presently, but will accrue and then will enable the missions that they seek, whether it's in the security domain or the blue water domain. So I want to sort of just foot stomp the progress that I think has been made in the commercial side of things. Again, not 100% of what India is seeking, but a lot more than what was on offer even a few years ago. I think even also independent of sort of just commercial technology, co-production and co-development, you have technology development taking place at a more sort of early stage level. So for example, IndusX, one of the first joint challenges between the US and India under the IndusX platform was for underwater domain communications and maritime ISR. And there were prize winners that were by both the Indian and the US side. I think that will lead to some further developments and potentially future teaming arrangements in that development of those technologies. I think there are opportunities, although they have not yet been seized, for joint R&D between our labs, so between our DRDO and US Defense Department and energy labs. One particular area that one of the previous speakers spoke about was, an issue of energy and power. And here, from my limited understanding, there's an opportunity for both countries to get their labs together to develop air aluminum batteries for sonobuoys, which would be sort of a much more durable and sustainable form of power for one of the sort of many sensing capabilities that we'd be using in the maritime domain. You're also seeing a lot of new types of sensing that are being developed by Indian companies and startups, but supported and financed by US venture capital in the electro-optical domain, radio frequency data, hyperspectral imaging. So all these areas, again, new forms of sensing that are being co-developed, whether it's through US capital, technology, or production agreements that are ultimately leading to benefits for sort of Indian underwater domain awareness more broadly. And then the last area that I think we are starting to see more, or have the potential to see more of in the future, is on training. And so much of this, as previous speakers have referred to, is it's not just about the technical or sort of technology capabilities, but the actual employment of them, right? So the diffusion of this within our armed forces, our navies, our Coast Guard, and the strategies for employment to best, not only sort of identify signal from noise, but then to, broadly sort of sense sort of what's going on sort of the undersea domain and how to track, adversary vessels or dark shipping or any of those assets. So I think that sort of the joint training part of this is going to be important. And so that maybe like leads to the last 2 points, which is about how do we operationalize these capabilities that we are building together. So the first is integrating some of these technologies into exercises and missions. We have regular exercises. Tiger Triumph is coming up in just a couple weeks. We have the Malabar exercise, which is de facto a quad exercise, as is Sea Dragon, which is a specific, which always includes quad countries, and it's specifically an anti-submarine warfare exercise. All these are opportunities to employ even the commercial technologies that we're experimenting with, either as field demonstrations or field experiments, or actual employment by warfighters in some of these exercises that are already designed to, create sort of subject matter expert exchanges, as well as sort of joint sort of teaming and training. So there are venues for this that I know of in the United States. There are major industry conferences that are tethered to U.S. strategic partners. So like there's recently, in just the beginning of March, there was the Pacific Operational Science and Technology Summit in Honolulu, partnered with Indo-Pacific. And there are field experiments opportunities, including an Indian company that participated in one of these field experiments, but it was a sort of unmanned, drone systems, not, I don't think it was a sea-based one, but nevertheless, these are opportunities for the technologies that we're co-developing to be tested, demonstrated in front of potential acquisition officers, investors, other companies for, again, sort of further commercial and co-development. Another one of these conferences is, one of these field testing opportunities is Coastal Trident, which is one that I know it's run out of an institution called FathomWorks in Port Hueneme in Southern California. It's been offered to India, to IDEX, for Indian companies to participate in. And I think those opportunities should be seized upon to, again, jointly develop this. The unique situation with FathomWorks is that it is a non-government entity, but it is partnered right next to a sort of a Navy base. And so you have the opportunity for commercial technologies to be tested under sort of military environments and conditions. So you have both, both parties present in those both observation and feedback. And then obviously taking this to the next level, from exercises and training to employment in joint missions. So we have what Michael referred to, the Combined Maritime Force. It's an opportunity to be field testing a lot of these technologies. If we have a future contingency that requires joint patrols or security collaboration, like similar to what we had with Operation Prosperity Guardian, whether India formally participates in it or collaborates with it in an auxiliary or adjacent role, these are opportunities for field testing some of these technologies that we're developing. Also, Task Force 59, which is sort of out of Central Command's naval components. That's a space where you can have sort of testing of manned and unmanned systems, or manned and unmanned teaming for some of these, unmanned sensor and sort of vessels that are going to be a critical part of maritime domain awareness and underwater domain awareness. So I think that sort of comes to the final. I mean, I was going to say something about deployment, but I think that's like effectively through the Combined Maritime Force or through quad patrols, you'll get opportunities for deployments. And ultimately, right, like these are peacetime applications, but we want these to be also ready for in case of a conflict time environment. And ultimately, that is about deterring aggression by PLAN vessels, by Chinese submarines that might be trying to stalk and coerce vessels in the Indian Ocean. And that, I think, is always going to be sort of foremost in the minds of U.S. policymakers and security officials. With that, I thanks for the time, and I look forward to further discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lalwani, for your comprehensive thoughts on technology that India and US both have been working on in terms of the maritime security cooperations, etc. So thank you so much for your keynote address, and I think with this we'll move on to the next speaker of the day. So there's a little bit of change in the way the sequence was, and right now we would like to call upon Dr. Sanjay Baru, who is a political commentator and an analyst from India. So a little bit about Dr. Sanjay Baru. He is a political commentator and policy analyst, and he has served as the Secretary General of the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry until his resignation in April 2018. And he was also the Director for Geoeconomics and Strategy at the International Institute of Strategic Studies. Mr. Baru was also the media advisor and chief spokesperson for the Prime Minister, the former Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh from 2004 to 2008. And he has held editorial positions at big media institutions in India like the Economic Times, the Times of India, the Business Standard. So I would just like to, open the floor for Dr. Baru to share his comments now. Over to you, Dr. Baru.
Thank you, Arnav, and thanks to Maritime Research Center. Well, I should add that my current affiliation is with the United Services Institution of India, which is the oldest armed forces think tank going back to 1870. That is where I'm presently affiliated to. Arnab, in your initial remarks, you referred to 9/11 and 26/11. But I think the significant date, as far as we are concerned, India is concerned, with respect to maritime domain awareness, is 2004 December, the tsunami. The tsunami was a milestone for two reasons. One, it raised the public and the consciousness of the public and the national security leadership about the significance of the Indian Ocean, understanding the dynamics of the Indian Ocean as far as the Indian economy is concerned. We had impact of the tsunami on India, particularly the coastal regions in southern India. And I was in government at the time. I was with the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh. And that it was in response to the tsunami that Prime Minister Manmohan Singh set up the National Disaster Management Authority, the NDMA, which is in fact headed by a retired general of the armed forces. And I think that is a significant turning point, that there is a realization of the importance of understanding the dynamics of the Indian Ocean for security and for development. But the second aspect to the tsunami was that it gave us an opportunity within 24 hours to work with other countries. Indian Navy, as some of our speakers here from the Navy know, that we worked with the United States, we worked with Indonesia, we worked with Singapore, and with other countries, with Japan, in delivering, assistance to Indonesia, particularly to Indonesia, but also in creating an architecture for regional cooperation in the context of the Indian Ocean. So I think the tsunami and its impact both on India and on the region was, in my judgment, an important turning point in raising awareness about the Indian Ocean. As some of you will recall, many years ago, we formed the IORA, which is the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which remained defunct for a long, long time. But there was a revival of IORA after the tsunami. And then, of course, more recently with Prime Minister Modi, we had SAGAR and now Mahasagar. It was just a couple of weeks back that Prime Minister Modi was in Mauritius, where he renamed the SAGAR, which is Security and Growth Across the Region, which was a framework for both security and development in the Indian Ocean region, renamed it as Mahasagar, which is mutual and harmonistic advancement of security and growth around the region. Now, the important thing about this approach is that we are linking development, uh, economic development in the region to security. I think Arnav made that point, and that's an important point for us to note, that we are not looking at Indian Ocean security only from the point of view of China or the military threat to the region, China's activities in the region, or indeed the activities of other countries, because almost every other country is now around in the Indian Ocean. The Americans are here, the French are here, the British are here, the Germans have been here. So there's a multi-country presence in the Indian Ocean, and I think therefore to keep a balance between development and security is an effort on India's part, and at least we in India should not forget that kind of framework for regional for any maritime strategy, maritime domain awareness, or underwater domain awareness. So for both of them. The second point I would make is that, and I think this is something which has been emphasized by the other speakers, is the need for technological collaboration. And here again, I would say it's not just the United States. I know two of our speakers this evening are from the US, but we have been working with the Japanese. I participated in an earlier panel discussion that Arnab hosted some months back, where we had a Japanese speaker, I think we are working with Singapore, with Japan, and we ought to work with Australia, with Indonesia, with South Africa. I think there are several countries here with whom we need to work together in order to widen our perspective, in order to acquire a better understanding of the region as a whole, and not simply the waters around the peninsula. So I think, a couple of speakers referred to bilateral, trilateral, plurilateral arrangements. I think plurilateral is the way to go, and bring in more countries. I'm not sure what initiatives are being taken in this regard by the present government. I have not kept track, but I would imagine that it's useful, even technologically useful. I mean, Japan has enormous technological competencies, which are significant competencies in underwater domain awareness, and I think therefore there are technological benefits to widening the scope of this cooperation, but also it helps us in managing regional security much better. So a framework which is larger than a bilateral one or even a trilateral one would, in my judgment, be in the long-term interests of India. Finally, the fourth point I would like to flag is the importance of policy integration. I think that is crucial in India, that there is not adequate integration between, first of all, between the ministries of defense, foreign affairs, and other shipping ministry and other related ministries, but even within defense, between Navy and Air Force and armed forces, etc. I think there's a need for a much better policy integration, because we are looking at multiple capabilities or multiple spheres of knowledge. I mean, for example, we do not, I believe, have a top-class underwater research institution. Correct me if I'm wrong. That is in a position, that is well funded, in a position to work with other countries in order to carry out research. And unless we invest in those technological capabilities, which requires much greater coordination at the national level in New Delhi between multiple agencies of the government, we would not have our own technology. And the point has been made that you might not get enough technology from the US. Maybe you'll get some in some areas, you won't get in other. But I don't think Indian strategy can be based on expecting technology from others. However much we may seek technology, technology is not easily made available. I mean, it's not as if it's on sale in the marketplace. There are areas in which government to government negotiations enable. But if there is greater research capability at home, our ability to access technology or our ability to understand new technologies as we cooperate with other countries will improve. And I think that's extremely important for us, that this capacity to be able to understand and incorporate and utilize. I emphasize this last point particularly because we are, I believe, entering a phase of increasing technology regulation. I think technology has been identified as a major, instrument of power of national security. Already, I'm aware of a lot of limitations being placed by governments around the world, particularly United States certainly, but many other governments on transfers of technology. In fact, the word transfer is a misnomer on even sale of technology. And I would expect this to increase. I do not expect a future of easier market access to new technologies. And I think this is certainly an area there are several other areas in which we have to improve our own technological capability. But underwater domain awareness, since that is what we are talking about today, is certainly an area in which, unless we have our own capability, our own capacity, and invest in our capacity, and create domestic, institutions that generate this capacity, and work with the Navy, work with the other, institutions of government, we are not going to be in a position to take advantage of whatever bilateral, trilateral, plurilateral cooperation we have with other countries. So thank you very much. Those are my views, and thank you for having me in this very interesting discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baru, for your excellent perspective on the topic and your views on the maritime partnership between the India and the US. Your points were very